Alright.
You start.
But I don't want to be Henry.
Do it!
Okay, there's a hole in my bucket, dear Brandy, dear Brandy. There's a hole in my bucket, dear Brandy, a hole.
Then fix it, dear Becca, dear Becca, dear Becca. Then fix it, dear Becca, dear Becca, fix it.
With what shall I fix it with, dear Brandy, dear Brandy? With what shall I fix it with, dear Brandy? With what?
With some straw, dear Becca, dear Becca, dear Becca. With some straw, dear Becca, some straw.
The straw is too long, dear Brandy, dear Brandy, dear Brandy. The straw is too long, dear Brandy. Too long.
Then cut it, dear Becca, dear Becca, dear Becca. Then cut it, dear Becca, dear Becca. Cut it.
With what shall I cut it with, dear Brandy, dear Brandy, dear Brandy? With what shall I cut it with, dear Brandy? Dear Brandy, with what?
With an axe, dear Becca, dear Becca, dear Becca. With an axe, dear Becca, an axe.
The axe is too
Not safe.
dull, dear Brandy, dear Brandy, dear Brandy.
Still not safe.
The axe is too dull, dear Brandy, too dull. Do not try this at home, kids.
Then sharpen it, dear
Sharpen
Becca,
it.
dear Becca, dear Becca. Then sharpen it, dear Becca, dear Becca, sharpen it.
With what shall I sharpen it with, dear Brandy, dear Brandy, dear Brandy? With what shall I sharpen it with, dear Brandy? With what?
A stone, dear Becca, dear Becca, dear Becca. A stone, dear Becca, dear Becca. A stone.
The stone is too dry, dear Brandy, dear Brandy, dear Brandy. Stone is too dry, dear Brandy, too dry.
Then wet it, dear Becca, dear Becca, dear Becca. Then wet it, dear Becca, dear Becca, wet it.
With what shall I wet it with, dear Brandy, dear Brandy, dear Brandy? With what shall I wet it with, dear Brandy, dear Brandy? With what?
Some water, dear Becca, dear Becca, dear Becca. Some water, dear Becca, dear Becca, some water.
How shall I fetch the water, dear Brandy, dear Brandy, dear Brandy? How shall I fetch the water, dear Brandy? Brandy, how shall I fetch it?
In a bucket, dear Becca, dear Becca, dear Becca. In a bucket, dear Becca, dear Becca, a bucket.
What part of there's a hole in my bucket, dear Brandy, dear Brandy? There's a hole in my bucket, dear Brandy. Do you not understand? Oh, women.